What if a law said no one could touch you, even to save your life? What if your coronation happened after you were already dead and buried? Can a king order his wife's execution just because she did not give him a son? History is filled with stories of power, wealth, and influence. But for some royal women, their final chapters were not tales of peaceful endings. They were stories of unbelievable circumstances, strange accidents, and political moves that ended in the most shocking ways imaginable. Their lives were extraordinary. Their deaths were even more so. Number 15. What if a law meant to protect you also ensured your death? She was only 19 years old when she died. She was pregnant with a son, the heir her husband desperately wanted. Her 2-year-old daughter died with her, and dozens of people watched it happen, forbidden to lift a finger to help. The story of Queen Sunandha Kumariratana of Siam is one of tragic irony. A rule designed to elevate her to a god-like status was the very thing that sealed her fate. Sunandha was one of the 4 queen consorts of King Chulalongkorn, also known as Ramavi of Siam, which is now Thailand. They were married in 1877. She was not just his wife, she was also his half-sister. Such marriages were common in the Siamese royal family to keep the bloodline pure. Sunandha was known to be the king's favorite. He loved her deeply. By 1880, she had already given him a daughter, Princess Karnaporn Bejaratana, and was expecting their second child. On May 31st, 1880, the queen and her daughter were traveling to the Bangpa in Royal Palace, the king's summer residence. They were not with the king, who was scheduled to join them later. They traveled by a royal barge on the Chao Phraya River, the main waterway flowing through the country. A separate, larger boat towed the queen's vessel. It was a routine trip, but then something went wrong. A strong current caught the vessels. The queen's barge, smaller and lighter, capsized. It flipped over, throwing the queen, her daughter, and their attendants into the river. They were in the middle of the water, struggling to stay afloat. The riverbank was lined with guards and servants. Other boats were nearby. There were many people who could have saved them, but no one did. They all just watched. They watched as their 19-year-old pregnant queen and their little princess drowned. This was not because they were cruel or indifferent. It was because they were terrified. An ancient and powerful law forbade any commoner from touching a member of the royal family. The belief was that the royals were sacred, divine beings. To touch them, even to help them, was to defile their sacredness. The penalty for breaking this law was death. The guards on the bank knew this law. The boatmen knew this law. Every person who witnessed the tragedy knew it. To jump into the water would have been an act of treason. So they were trapped. They could save their queen and be executed, or they could obey the law and let her die. They chose to obey the law. By the time word reached the palace and a proper rescue could be attempted by those of rank, it was too late. Queen Sunandha and Princess Karnaporn were gone. When King Chulalongkorn learned what had happened, his grief was immense. He was not just a king who had lost a queen, he was a husband who had lost his beloved wife and children. He was also a modernizer, a king who was trying to bring Siam into the modern world. He was horrified that such an archaic tradition had led to such a pointless and preventable loss. In the aftermath, the king ordered a grand and elaborate funeral that lasted for months, a testament to his love for Sunandha. But he also took action. The officials who were present and did nothing were punished, though the king knew the real fault lay with the tradition, not the men. He eventually worked to abolish the strict law against touching royals, recognizing that human life was more valuable than any ritual. He had several memorials built in her honor, including a marble monument at the Bangpa in Palace. It stands there today, a sad reminder of a young queen who was so revered that no one was allowed to save her life. Number 14, can you be crowned queen after you are already dead? Her killers thought they had ended her story. They stabbed her in front of her children and left her in a hurried grave. But the man who loved her would not let her be forgotten. He hunted down her murderers. Then he did something no one in history had ever done before. He had her body dug up, placed on a throne, and demanded the entire court kneel and kiss her decomposing hand. This is the story of Ines de Castro, the posthumous Queen of Portugal. Ines was a noblewoman from Galicia who arrived in Portugal around 1340. She was a lady-in-waiting to Constanza of Castile, the wife of the heir to the Portuguese throne, Prince Pedro. Pedro was immediately captivated by Ines. She was beautiful and charming. They began a secret affair. It was a dangerous game. Pedro was married, and Ines was his wife's cousin. Their love was a political scandal waiting to happen. Constanza eventually died in 1345 after giving birth to a son. Pedro was now a widower, free to marry again. His father, King Afonso IV, wanted him to make a strategic marriage to another foreign princess. But Pedro refused. His heart belonged to Ines. He secretly moved her into a palace, and they lived together as a family, having 4 children. This enraged the king and his court. They feared the influence of Ines and her ambitious brothers. They worried that Pedro might try to make his children with Ines the true heirs, pushing aside his legitimate son with Constanza. The whispers in the court grew louder. They called Ines a Spanish witch who had bewitched the prince. King Afonso IV decided he had to act. While Pedro was away on a hunting trip in January 1355, the king and 3 of his counselors went to the palace where Ines lived with her children. They found her, and she begged for her life. She pleaded with the king to have mercy, showing him their shared grandchildren. The king was reportedly moved by her pleas and almost changed his mind. But his counselors were relentless. They pressured him, telling him that the stability of the kingdom was at stake. The king gave in. The 3 men, Pero Coelho, Alvaro Goncalves, and Diogo Lopez Pacheco, stabbed Ines de Castro to death. When Pedro returned and found Ines dead, his grief turned into a white-hot rage. He declared war on his own father. A brief civil war tore through Portugal before a fragile truce was reached, but Pedro never forgave the king or the killers. 2 years later, in 1357, King Afonso IV died. Pedro became King Pedro I of Portugal. Now he had the power to get his revenge. He announced that he had secretly married Ines years before. This made her his lawful wife and therefore the rightful Queen of Portugal. Her children were now legitimate. Then he hunted down her killers. 2 of them were found in Castile and extradited. Pedro subjected them to a brutal public execution. The 3rd escaped, but that was not enough for Pedro. He wanted the world to recognize Ines as his queen. In 1361, he ordered her body to be exhumed from its grave. He had her dressed in royal robes and jewels. He then placed her corpse on the throne next to his. He commanded every noble and clergyman in the kingdom to come forward, bow before their dead queen, and kiss the hem of her gown or her skeletal hand as a sign of their allegiance. It must have been a terrifying and surreal ceremony. After this bizarre coronation, Pedro had a magnificent tomb built for her in the monastery of Alcobaça. He later had his own tomb constructed directly opposite hers. He ordered that they be placed foot to foot so that on the day of judgment, the first thing they would see upon rising would be each other. He never remarried and ruled for another decade, known as Pedro the Just or Pedro the Cruel, depending on who you asked. His love for Ines de Castro became a legend, a story of a passion so strong it reached beyond the grave to crown a dead woman queen. Number 13, could a queen's trust in her doctors lead to her own demise? She lay in her bed for 11 days fully conscious, while her body ruptured from the inside. Her husband, the King of Great Britain, was so distraught he refused to leave her side, his grief so profound it would affect him for the rest of his life. Queen Caroline of Ansbach was one of the most intelligent and politically savvy women of her time, but her death was a slow, agonizing spectacle caused by a medical condition that her doctors, despite their best efforts, made fatally worse. Caroline was the wife of King George II. She was born in 1683 in Germany and was highly educated. When she married George, then Prince of Hanover, in 1705, it was a love match. He adored her and, unusually for the time, respected her intellect. When he became king in 1727, Caroline became his most trusted advisor. She wielded immense influence behind the scenes, often steering government policy through her relationship with the Prime Minister, Sir Robert Walpole. She was a patron of the arts and sciences, a friend to philosophers like Voltaire. She was a powerful and modern woman. But for years she had a secret. She suffered from an umbilical hernia, a condition where part of the intestine pushes through a weak spot in the abdominal muscles. It was likely caused by her eighth and final pregnancy in 1724. In the 18th century, such a condition was not just painful, it was dangerous. And for a queen, it was deeply embarrassing. She kept it hidden from almost everyone, including her husband. She endured the pain in silence for over a decade. In November 1737, the pain became unbearable. On November 9th, she fell ill with what was first thought to be colic. She was in agony. Finally, she confessed her long-held secret to her lady in waiting. Doctors were summoned. What followed was a catalog of medical horror, a reflection of the brutal limitations of medicine at the time. The king's physicians had no idea how to properly treat a strangulated hernia, where the intestine becomes trapped and its blood supply is cut off. They tried everything they could think of. They bled her. They gave her powerful purgatives and enemas. They applied strange poultices. Nothing worked. The pain only grew worse. Finally, they decided surgery was the only option. Anesthetics did not exist. The queen had to endure the procedure fully awake. Dr. John Ranby, a royal surgeon, made an incision to try and push the intestine back into place. The attempt failed. In fact, the surgeon's probing and cutting likely made the situation much worse, possibly perforating the bowel. For the next week, Caroline's condition deteriorated. She was stoic and brave throughout. She knew she was dying. She said her goodbyes to her children and her husband. In a famous and heartbreaking moment, she urged the weeping George II to remarry after her death. He sobbed, "No, I shall have mistresses," Caroline reportedly replied. "Ah, mon Dieu, cela n'empêche pas," which means, "My God, that doesn't prevent it." And it was a flash of the wit and realism that had defined her life. Her final days were excruciating. The rupture in her bowel led to infection and gangrene. The contents of her intestines began to leak out of the surgical wound. The smell in the room was said to be overpowering. Yet the king rarely left her side. On November 20th, 1737, after 11 days of agony, Queen Caroline died. Her official cause of death was mortification of the bowels. An autopsy later revealed the full extent of the damage. King George II was inconsolable. He had a special coffin made for them with a removable side so that when he died, their ashes could mingle. He outlived her by 23 years and never remarried. Caroline's death was a tragedy born of 18th century ignorance. She was a brilliant woman, a force in politics and culture, brought down by a common medical problem that today would be fixed with a routine operation. Number 12. What happens when a fairy tale empress meets a pointless end? She was obsessed with her beauty, her waistline so small it seemed unnatural. She spent hours each day just on her hair, which was so long it reached the floor. She was a poet who felt trapped in the rigid world of the imperial court. Empress Elisabeth of Austria, known as Sisi, was a figure of legend. Her life was a mix of glamour and deep sadness. Her death was just a strange, a sudden, almost unnoticed attack that ended a fairy tale in the most brutal and random way. Elizabeth was born into Bavarian royalty in 1837. At just 16 years old, she married her cousin, Emperor Franz Joseph I of Austria. She was thrust into the center of the Habsburg court in Vienna, one of the most formal and stifling in Europe. She was unprepared for it. She hated the strict etiquette and the constant public scrutiny. She felt isolated and unhappy. So she retreated into a world of her own making. She became fixated on her appearance. Her diet was extreme. She often ate only broth or the juice of raw meat to maintain her figure. Her waist measured a mere 19 inches. Her exercise routines were punishing, but her greatest pride was her hair. It was a magnificent curtain of chestnut brown hair that, when unpinned, cascaded to her ankles. It was so heavy It sometimes gave her headaches. A hairdresser would spend 3 hours every day braiding and coiling it. As she grew older, her unhappiness deepened. The death of her son, Crown Prince Rudolph, in a tragic pact in 1889, shattered her. After that, she wore only black for the rest of her life. She traveled constantly, wandering across Europe, trying to escape her grief and the court she despised. She wrote melancholic poetry and became a recluse, often hiding her face behind a fan or a parasol. In September 1898, the 60-year-old empress was traveling under a false name, the Countess of Hohenems. She was in Geneva, Switzerland, staying at the Hotel Beau Rivage. On the afternoon of September 10th, she was walking with her lady and waiting along the shore of Lake Geneva. Further on their way to board a steamship to Montreux, as they walked, a young man ran towards them. He seemed to stumble. As he passed, he bumped into the Empress. Elisabeth fell to the ground. She was helped up, seemingly unhurt. She was more annoyed than anything else. She checked her clothes, thanked the passers-by who helped her, and continued walking to the boat, a distance of about 100 yards. It was only after she was on board the ship, as it was pulling away from the dock, that she collapsed. Her lady-in-waiting opened her bodice to help her breathe and saw a small, dark stain. No one had realized it at first, but the man who had stumbled had not just bumped into her. He had attacked her. He was an Italian anarchist named Luigi Lucchini. He had been planning to assassinate the Prince of Orleans, but the prince had changed his travel plans. Lucchini, determined to kill a royal, any royal, to make a political statement, saw a newspaper article saying the Empress of Austria was in town. He decided she would be his victim. He had armed himself with a crude weapon, a 4-inch-long stiletto, thin and sharp, like an industrial needle. When he bumped into her, he had thrust it into her chest. The blade was so slender and the wound so small that it barely bled. And Elisabeth's tightly laced corset had acted like a pressure bandage, staunching the flow of blood. She did not even feel the stab, thinking she had just been punched. But the stiletto had pierced her lung and her heart. Once the corset was loosened on the boat, the internal bleeding began in earnest. The ship immediately turned back to Geneva. The Empress was carried back to her hotel room, but there was nothing to be done. She was pronounced dead within an hour of the attack. The death of the beautiful, reclusive Empress sent shockwaves across Europe. It was not a grand political assassination. It was a random, senseless act of violence. Luigi Lucchini was caught and boasted of his crime. He said he wanted to kill someone important to protest the wealth of the elite. Elisabeth just happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. Her life, which she felt was so constrained and meaningless, ended in a way that was equally random and without purpose. Number 11. Was she truly mad or just a political pawn? For, nearly 50 years, she was a prisoner in, a dark, windowless room. She was the rightful queen of Spain, but she never ruled. Her own family, first her father, then her son, kept her locked away, claiming she was insane. But was Joanna of Castile really mad? Or was she just a woman with a broken heart whose passion and grief were used as a weapon against her by the men who wanted her power? Her long, slow death in confinement is one of history's great tragedies. Joanna was born in 1479, the daughter of the famous Queen Isabella I and King Ferdinand II of Spain. They were the monarchs who united Spain and funded Christopher Columbus. Joanna was intelligent and well-educated. In 1496, she was sent to Flanders to marry Philip the Handsome, the Duke of Burgundy. It was a political match, but for Joanna it became an all-consuming love affair. She was deeply, obsessively in love with her husband. Philip, however, was not faithful. His constant philandering drove Joanna into fits of jealous rage. This was the first time her emotional state was used against her. People at court began to whisper that she was unstable. In 1504, her mother, Queen Isabella, died. Her will named Joanna as the Queen of Castile, the larger part of Spain. But there was a catch. The will also stated that if Joanna was willing or unable to rule, her father Ferdinand should govern in her name. This was the opening her father and her husband needed. They both wanted to control Castile. They began to paint a picture of Joanna as mentally unfit. The situation came to a head in 1506. Philip brought Joanna back to Spain to claim her throne. On the journey, Philip suddenly fell ill with a fever and died within days. Joanna's world fell apart. Her grief was epic. She refused to leave her husband's coffin. She had it opened repeatedly so she could kiss his feet. She traveled with his body across the country for months, a grim procession in the dead of night, refusing to let him be buried. This bizarre behavior was all the proof her enemies needed. They declared her Juana la Loca, Joanna the Mad. Her father Ferdinand seized control. In 1509, he had Joanna confined to the royal convent of Santa Clara in Tordesillas, a small town in central Spain. She was a queen, but she was now a prisoner. She was allowed to keep her youngest daughter with her, but otherwise she was isolated. Her father ruled as regent. When Ferdinand died in 1516, Joanna's son, Charles, came to Spain to claim the throne. He was a teenager who had been raised in Flanders and barely knew his mother. He visited her in Tordesillas. He saw a woman who had been locked away for years, who was melancholic and perhaps unstable. Instead of freeing her, he made her confinement even stricter. He became King Charles I of Spain, and later Holy Roman Emperor Charles V. He ruled in his mother's name. For official documents, both their names appeared, but Joanna had no power. She was a ghost queen. For the next 39 years, she remained in the convent. Reports from her keepers describe her as deeply depressed, often refusing to eat, wash, or change her clothes. They claimed she would scream and rage. But these reports were from people paid by her son to keep her imprisoned. Modern historians question the diagnosis of madness. She may have suffered from severe depression or another mental illness triggered by her husband's death and her family's betrayal. But it is just as likely that her madness was a convenient fiction. She was a woman in a man's world. Her passionate nature, her deep love, and her profound grief were seen as signs of insanity. By declaring her mad, her father and son could legally take her power. She died in her prison at Tordesillas in April 1555 at the age of 75. She had been queen for 51 years, but had been a prisoner for 46 of them. Her life ended not with a bang, but with a long, slow fade in a lonely room, a queen in name only. Her legacy forever tied to the question of whether she was truly mad, or simply the victim of a terrible betrayal. Number 10, how do you lose your head for failing to produce a son? She changed the course of English history. For her, a king broke with the Catholic Church, divorced his wife of 24 years, and declared himself the head of a new religion. She was promised the world, but in the end, all she got was a French swordsman and a small patch of grass inside the Tower of London. The fall of Anne Boleyn was swift, brutal, and shocking. It showed that the love of King Henry V was a dangerous thing, and his desperation for a male heir was deadly. Anne Boleyn was not a traditional beauty of her time, but she was captivating. She had dark eyes, was stylish, witty, and intelligent. Well, she spent her youth in the sophisticated courts of France and returned to England in the early 1520s. She caught the eye of King Henry VIII, who was then married to Catherine of Aragon. At first, Henry just wanted her as his mistress. But Anne refused she would be his queen or nothing. This set in motion a chain of events that would reshape England. Where Henry became obsessed with Anne and with the idea that his marriage to Catherine was cursed because she had been his brother's wife. Catherine had given him a daughter, Mary, but no living sons. Henry needed an heir to secure the Tudor dynasty. He convinced himself that marrying Anne was the answer. He sought an annulment from the Pope. When the Pope refused, Henry, guided by advisors like Thomas Cromwell, took a radical step. He broke away from the authority of Rome and established the Church of England, with himself as its head. In 1533, he finally married a pregnant Anne Boleyn. For a brief time, Anne was on top of the world. She was crowned queen in a lavish ceremony. In September 1533, she gave birth. Everyone hoped for a prince, but the child was a girl, Elizabeth. It was a bitter disappointment for Henry, but he was still hopeful. Anne, however, failed to produce a son. She had at least 2 miscarriages after Elizabeth's birth. The final one, in January 1536, was a boy. This, for Henry, was the last straw. His passion for Anne had cooled. He was already looking at another woman, Jane Seymour. Suddenly, Anne was vulnerable. Her enemies at court, who had always resented her, saw their chance, and Thomas Cromwell, the man who had helped her rise, now orchestrated her fall. He needed to get Anne out of the way so Henry could marry Jane Seymour and, hopefully, get his son. A divorce would be difficult and would call into question the legitimacy of the entire break with Rome. A quicker, cleaner solution was needed. In April 1536, the accusations began. They were shocking and almost certainly fabricated. Anne was accused of adultery with 5 men, including her own brother, George Boleyn. The charge against her brother was the most heinous, designed to turn public opinion completely against her. She was also accused of plotting to kill the king and of using witchcraft to trap him into marriage. It was a sham. The evidence was flimsy, based on gossip and confessions extracted under duress, but it was enough. She was arrested on May 2nd and taken to the Tower of London. Her trial was a formality. On May 15th, she and her brother were found guilty of treason. The men accused with her were executed 2 days later. The king showed one small mercy. He decreed that Anne should not be burned at the stake, the usual punishment for female traitors, but beheaded. He even granted her last request to be executed by a skilled swordsman from France rather than the clumsy English axeman. On the morning of May 19th, 1536, less than 3 years after she was crowned queen, Anne Boleyn walked to a scaffold erected on Tower Green. She was calm and composed. She gave a short speech, careful not to criticize the king. She knelt down, and the French swordsman, with a single stroke, ended her life. The very next day, Henry Vede was formally betrothed to Jane Seymour. He married her 10 days later. Anne Boleyn's crime was not treason. Her crime was failing to give a king the son he craved. Number 9, could a queen's past loves cost her her future? She was a teenager, barely out of childhood, when she became the 5th wife of the aging, obese, and increasingly tyrannical King Henry V. She was young, vivacious, and perhaps a little foolish. She thought she could outrun her past. But in the Tudor court, secrets were a currency, and her history of youthful romances became a death sentence. The story of Catherine Howard is a tragic tale of a girl who was given a crown she was not prepared for and paid for it with her life. And Catherine Howard was a niece of the powerful Duke of Norfolk, the same family as Anne Boleyn. She came to court in 1539 as a lady in waiting to Henry's 4th wife, Anne of Cleves. Henry was instantly smitten. After his disastrous, short-lived marriage to Anne of Cleves was annulled, he turned his attention to Catherine. He was nearly 50 years old, suffering from a festering leg wound, and massively overweight. She was around 17, pretty, and full of life. He called her his, Rose without a thorn. They were married in July 1540. For a year, Catherine was the king's delight. He showered her with gifts and seemed rejuvenated by his young bride. Catherine, for her part, enjoyed the perks of being queen. But she was naive. She did not understand the dangerous political games of the court, and she had a past. Before she ever met the king, while living in the household of her step-grandmother, the Dowager Duchess of Norfolk, Catherine had been involved with 2 men. The first was her music teacher, Henry Mannix. The second was a gentleman named Francis Dereham. Her relationship with Dereham was particularly serious. They had referred to each other as husband and wife. This was essentially a pre-contract of marriage, which in Tudor times could be considered legally binding. When Catherine became queen, she made a fatal mistake. She brought people from her past into her court. She appointed Francis Dereham as one of her secretaries. She also began a reckless flirtation and likely an affair with a courtier named Thomas Culpeper, a favorite of the king. They would meet in secret with the help of one of Catherine's ladies-in-waiting, Lady Rochford, the widow of George Boleyn. It was only a matter of time before someone talked. In the autumn of 1541, a man who knew of Catherine's past in the Duchess's household revealed the story to religious reformers who were enemies of Catherine's powerful Catholic family. The information quickly reached the Archbishop of Canterbury, Thomas Cranmer. Cranmer knew he had a duty to inform the king, but he was terrified of Henry's explosive temper. He chose to give the king a letter detailing the accusations during Mass on November 2nd. Henry at first refused to believe it. He loved his young queen. He ordered an investigation, expecting to prove her innocence, but the evidence mounted. Francis Dereham and Thomas Culpeper were arrested and interrogated. Under pressure, they confessed. Letters were found, including one from Catherine to Culpeper, which sealed their fate. When Henry was finally shown the proof, he broke down and wept. His rose without a thorn had betrayed him. The fall was swift. Catherine was stripped of her title as queen and placed under house arrest. Dereham and Culpeper were executed in December 1541. Parliament then passed a Bill of Attainder, a law which declared a person guilty of a crime without a trial. It was specifically aimed at Catherine. The bill made it treason for an unchaste woman to marry the king. It was a retroactive law designed to ensure her death. On February 13th, 1442, Catherine Howard was taken to the Tower of London. She was just a few months past her probable 19th birthday. Legend says that the night before her execution, she asked for the block to be brought to her room so she could practice laying her head upon it. The next morning, she was led to the same spot on Tower Green where her cousin Anne Boleyn had died. She made a speech, admitting her guilt and asking for prayers. Then, with a single blow of the axe, the teenage queen was dead. Her crime was not just adultery. It was having a past that the king did not know about and being careless enough to let it catch up with her. Number 8. What does it take for one queen to sign another's death warrant? For nearly 20 years, she was a prisoner. She was a queen in her own right, but she was held captive by her own cousin. Theirs was a rivalry born of religion, politics, and blood. In the end, one queen had to die so the other could live securely on her throne. The execution of Mary, Queen of Scots, ordered by Queen Elizabeth I of England, was the dramatic climax of a lifetime of conflict, a decision that Elizabeth agonized over and may have regretted for the rest of her days. Mary Stuart became Queen of Scotland when she was just 6 days old in 1542. She was sent to France as a child and married the French heir, becoming Queen of France as well. She was beautiful, charming, and a devout Catholic. She also had a strong claim to the English throne. She was the granddaughter of Henry V's older sister, Margaret Tudor. For many Catholics who did not recognize Henry V's marriage to Anne Boleyn, Mary was the true Queen of England, not the Protestant Elizabeth. After her husband, the King of France, died, Mary returned to Scotland in 1561 to rule. Her reign was a disaster. She was a Catholic queen in a newly Protestant country. Her personal life was tumultuous. Her second marriage, to her cousin Lord Darnley, was a violent failure. Darnley was murdered in a mysterious explosion, and Mary quickly married the chief suspect, the Earl of Bothwell. This turned the Scottish lords against her. In 1568, she was forced to abdicate her throne in favor of her infant son, James. She fled Scotland, seeking refuge in England and the help of her cousin Elizabeth I. It was a terrible miscalculation. For Elizabeth, Mary's arrival in England was a nightmare. Mary was not just a cousin seeking shelter, she was a rival claimant to the throne and a Catholic icon. To let her go free was to invite rebellion from English Catholics and plots from foreign powers like Spain. To help her regain the Scottish throne was impossible, so Elizabeth did the only thing she felt she could do. She placed Mary under house arrest. For the next 19 years, Mary lived as a captive in various English castles. She was a queen without a kingdom, a prisoner in gilded cages. But she was not idle. She became the focal point of numerous plots to assassinate Elizabeth and place Mary on the English throne. Elizabeth's spymaster, Sir Francis Walsingham, watched her every move. His network of spies was vast and efficient. The final straw was the Babington Plot in 1586. Walsingham's agents intercepted letters between Mary and a group of Catholic conspirators led by Anthony Babington. The letters were written in a complex code. Walsingham's codebreakers deciphered them. Crucially, they found a letter in which Mary explicitly approved of the plan to assassinate Elizabeth. Walsingham had his proof. Mary was put on trial for treason in October 1586. She defended herself eloquently, arguing that an anointed Queen of Scotland could not be tried by an English court. But the evidence was overwhelming. She was found guilty and sentenced to death. Now, Elizabeth faced a terrible choice. To execute Mary would be to kill another anointed queen, a family member, and the mother of the heir to the Scottish throne, who was also a potential heir to the English throne. It was a dangerous precedent. Elizabeth hesitated for months. She was tormented by the decision. She tried to find other solutions. She even hinted that she wished Mary's jailer would just quietly murder her to spare Elizabeth from having to give the official order. But her council, led by Walsingham and William Cecil, pressured her relentlessly. They told her that as long as Mary lived, Elizabeth's life was in danger and England was at risk of civil war and foreign invasion. Finally, on February 1st, 1587, Elizabeth signed the death warrant. Even then, she was conflicted, later claiming her secretary had presented it to her without her fully understanding what she was doing. On the morning of February 8th, 1587, at Fotheringhay Castle, Mary, Queen of Scots, walked to her execution. She was 44 years old. Dressed in defiant crimson, the color of Catholic martyrdom, she went to her death with courage and dignity. The execution itself was shockingly clumsy. The first blow of the axe did not sever her neck, and it took a second, and possibly a third, to finish the job. When the executioner held up her head, her auburn wig fell off, revealing that the once beautiful queen had short gray hair. In a final, bizarre twist, her small Skye Terrier, which had been hiding in the folds of her dress, was discovered, covered in his mistress's blood, and refused to leave her body. And Elizabeth had secured her throne, but the act of killing her cousin haunted her. Number 7. How does a queen of fashion become a symbol of a revolution's fury? She never actually said, "Let them eat cake." But it did not matter. To the starving people of France, she was the embodiment of everything that was wrong with the monarchy. Her lavish lifestyle, her foreign birth, and her perceived indifference to their suffering made her a target of vicious propaganda. Marie Antoinette went from being a teenage princess to a hated queen, and finally to the widow Capet, a prisoner in a cart, her hair shorn, on her way to the guillotine. Her death was not just an execution, it was a political spectacle that marked the brutal end of an era. Marie Antoinette was born an Archduchess of Austria in 1755. At just 14, she was sent to France to marry the future King Louis XVI. It was a political alliance, not a romance. The French court at Versailles was a snake pit of etiquette and intrigue, and the young Austrian princess struggled to fit in. She was homesick and lonely. Her husband Louis was shy and indecisive. To cope, she threw herself into a world of fashion, parties, and extravagance. She built a fantasy peasant village, the Hameau de Lorraine, at Versailles, where she and her friends could play at being milkmaids. She spent fortunes on dresses, jewels, and towering hairstyles. While this might have been normal for royalty, France was in deep financial trouble. The country was on the brink of bankruptcy. As stories of the Queen's spending spread, they were exaggerated by pamphlets and cartoons. She was depicted as frivolous, immoral, and out of touch with the struggles of ordinary people. She was Madame Deficit. When the French Revolution began in 1789, the royal family's world began to shrink. In October, a mob of Parisian women, furious over the price of bread, marched on Versailles and forced the king and queen to move to the Tuileries Palace in Paris. They were effectively prisoners. In 1791, they made a desperate attempt to flee France, the flight to Varennes. They were caught near the border and brought back to Paris in disgrace. This destroyed any remaining trust the people had in the monarchy. It proved the king and queen were traitors. In 1792, the monarchy was abolished, and France was declared a republic. The royal family was imprisoned in the Temple Fortress. Louis XVI was put on trial, found guilty of treason, and executed by guillotine in January 1793. Marie Antoinette was now a widow, alone with her children in prison. The radicals in the new government were not finished. They needed to destroy every last symbol of the old regime, and the former queen was the most powerful symbol of all. In October 1793, she was put on trial. The charges were absurd and cruel. She was accused of depleting the national treasury and of conspiring with foreign enemies. The most vicious accusation was that she had abused her own young son. She defended herself with a quiet dignity that surprised many. When faced with the charge concerning her son, she appealed to the mothers in the courtroom, saying, "Nature itself refuses to answer such a charge laid against a mother." But the verdict was never in doubt. She was found guilty. On the morning of October 16th, 1793, her hair was cut off. Unlike her husband, who was taken to his execution in a covered carriage, she was placed in an open cart, like a common criminal. She had to endure the jeers and insults of the Parisian crowds on the long journey to the Place de la Révolution. She was 37 years old, but she looked like an old woman. Her hair had turned white from stress. Dressed in a simple white shift, she climbed the steps of the scaffold. She accidentally stepped on the executioner's foot, and her last words were, "Pardon me, sir. I did not do it on purpose." A few moments later, the blade of the guillotine fell. The executioner held her head up for the crowd to see. Her death was meant to be a victory for the revolution, the final destruction of royal tyranny. Number 6. What do you do when your own son wants you dead? He tried to poison her 3 times. When that failed, he designed a special machine to make her ceiling collapse on her while she slept. It did not work. Then, he built a collapsible boat designed to fall apart at sea and drown her. She survived that too. The story of Agrippina the Younger and her son, the Roman Emperor Nero, is a chilling tale of a mother's ambition and a son's paranoia, culminating in one of the most bizarre and persistent murder plots in history. Agrippina the Younger, born in 15 AD, was a formidable figure in the Roman Empire. She was the sister of one Emperor Caligula, the wife of another Claudius, who was also her uncle, and the mother of a third, Nero. She was ruthless, intelligent, and power-hungry. Her main goal in life was to see her son, Nero, on the throne. She achieved this in 54 AD by allegedly poisoning her husband Claudius with a dish of mushrooms. Nero, then just 16 years old, became emperor. In the beginning, Agrippina was the true power behind the throne. She appeared on coins alongside her son. She advised him on policy and effectively ruled the Roman Empire, but Nero began to resent her control. He wanted to rule on his own. He also fell in love with a former slave, Poppaea Sabina, who hated Agrippina and encouraged Nero to get rid of his domineering mother. Nero decided his mother had to die, but it had to look like an accident. He couldn't just execute her. Matricide was the most unforgivable crime in Roman society. So began a series of increasingly elaborate and farcical murder attempts, as described by the historian Tacitus. First came the poison. Nero tried to poison her, but Agrippina, who had grown up in the treacherous world of the imperial family, had long been taking small doses of various poisons to build up an immunity. The attempts failed. Next, Nero turned to engineering. He had a device installed in the ceiling above her bed designed to drop heavy panels on her as she slept. But someone in on the plot got nervous and warned Agrippina. The plan was foiled. His most famous attempt came in 59 AD. Nero invited his mother to a lavish banquet at his villa in Baiae on the Bay of Naples. He was charming and affectionate, pretending they had reconciled. After the dinner, he escorted her to a specially designed boat that was meant to take her home. The boat was a death trap. It was built so that, once at sea, its lead-weighted canopy would collapse and the hull would split apart. The plan was set in motion. The boat was rowed out into the calm, moonlit bay. The signal was given. The canopy fell, but it was fouled by the heavy furniture of Agrippina's couch, which created a protective arch over her. It killed one of her attendants, but Agrippina and another friend, Acerronia, survived the collapse. Then the crew, trying to sink the damaged vessel, started rushing to one side. In the confusion, Acerronia, thinking she would be rescued if she identified herself, cried out, "I am Agrippina, help the emperor's mother." The crew, thinking she was the real Agrippina, beat her to death with their oars. The real Agrippina, wounded but silent, slipped into the water. Despite a shoulder injury, the 43-year-old woman managed to swim until she was picked up by a small fishing boat and taken to her own villa. When Nero heard that she had survived yet again, he panicked. He knew she would now be aware of his intentions and would seek revenge. He abandoned all pretense of an accident. He sent a group of soldiers to her villa, led by his former tutor, Anicetus. They found Agrippina in her bedroom. She knew her time was up. When the soldiers surrounded her, she looked at them, pointed to her womb, and said, "Strike here." She was indicating the part of her body that had given birth to her monstrous son. The soldiers stabbed her to death. And Nero, it is said, came to view her body and commented on its beauty, a chilling end to a deadly family drama. Number 5. Can a fairy tale life end in a split second? She was a Hollywood icon, the epitome of cool elegance and grace. She starred in classic films and won an Academy Award. Then she gave it all up to marry a prince and live in a palace on the Mediterranean coast. The life of Grace Kelly, Princess of Monaco, was a modern fairy tale. But fairy tales are not supposed to end on a winding mountain road in the twisted wreckage of a car. Her sudden, shocking death in 1982 stunned the world and brought a tragic end to a story that had captivated millions. Grace Kelly was born in Philadelphia in 1929 to a wealthy and ambitious family. She decided to become an actress and quickly rose to stardom in the 1950s. She was a favorite of director Alfred Hitchcock, starring in his films Deal M for Murder, Rear Window, and To Catch a Thief. In 1955, she won the Oscar for Best Actress for her role in The Country Girl. She was at the peak of her career, one of the biggest stars in the world. In 1955, she attended the Cannes Film Festival. During the festival, she was invited to a photo session at the Prince's Palace of Monaco with Prince Rainier III. The prince was the ruler of the tiny, glamorous principality. He was looking for a wife. A marriage to a Hollywood star would bring much-needed attention and tourism to Monaco. For Grace, it was a chance to escape the pressures of Hollywood. A whirlwind romance followed. In 1956, they were married in a spectacular ceremony that was dubbed the Wedding of the Century. Where Grace Kelly, the movie star, became Her Serene Highness, Princess Grace of Monaco. She retired from acting at the age of 26 to embrace her new role. She had 3 children, Caroline, Albert, and Stephanie. She became a beloved figure in Monaco, known for her charity work and her dedication to her family. She brought a level of glamour and sophistication to the principality that it had never known before. The world remained fascinated by her. She was a real-life princess. On September 13, 1982, Princess Grace, then 52, was driving from her country home back to the palace in Monaco. Her 17-year-old daughter, Princess Stephanie, was in the passenger seat. They were driving a 10-year-old Rover 3500. The road was the Moyenne Corniche, a notoriously winding and steep mountain road that Grace herself had driven on in the film To Catch a Thief. As she navigated a sharp hairpin turn, the car suddenly accelerated. It veered off the road, crashed through a retaining wall, and plunged more than 100 feet down a steep, rocky embankment. It came to rest in a garden, a mangled wreck. Princess Stephanie managed to crawl out of a window, suffering a hairline fracture of a vertebra and other minor injuries. The Princess Grace was unconscious, trapped in the wreckage. Emergency services arrived and rushed them both to the hospital, which was ironically named the Princess Grace Hospital Center. At the hospital, doctors discovered the extent of her injuries. She had suffered a major brain hemorrhage. A CT scan revealed she had 2 hemorrhages. The first was a minor stroke, which doctors believe happened just before the crash, causing her to lose control of the car. The second, much larger hemorrhage was caused by the trauma of the accident itself. She was placed on life support, but she had irreversible brain damage. The next day, on September 14th, 1982, after consulting with their children, Prince Rainier made the heartbreaking decision to turn off the life support machine. Princess Grace was dead. The news sent a shockwave of grief around the world. It was an unbelievable end to a storybook life. Because Stephanie was initially the only one who could speak and was in a state of shock, the exact circumstances of the crash were at first unclear, leading to years of speculation and conspiracy theories. But the official cause was clear: a tragic medical event that led to a fatal car accident. The princess, who seemed to have it all — fame, beauty, a royal title, a loving family — was gone in an instant, a victim of a cruel and random twist of fate on a sunny afternoon drive. Number 4. When a simple drive becomes a national tragedy, what is lost? She was known as the Snow Princess for her Scandinavian beauty and her kind, gentle nature. She was a young queen, adored by her people, who seemed to have stepped straight out of a storybook. She had a handsome king, 3 beautiful children, and a life of promise ahead of her. But in the summer of 1935, on a beautiful day by a Swiss lake, a moment of distraction on a country road led to a disaster that plunged a nation into mourning. The death of Queen Astrid of Belgium was a shockingly sudden event that echoed the tragic loss of another princess decades later. Astrid of Sweden was born in 1905. She was a princess in her own right, the niece of the King of Sweden. She was known for being warm, stylish, and down-to-earth. In 1926, she married Prince Leopold of Belgium. It was a genuine love match, not a political arrangement, which was rare for royals at the time. The Belgian people were immediately charmed by their new princess. In 1934, Leopold's father, King Albert I, was killed in a mountaineering accident. Leopold became King Leopold III, and Astrid, at just 29 years old, became the Queen of the Belgians. She was immensely popular. She devoted herself to her family and to charitable causes, particularly those involving women and children. She had a way of connecting with ordinary people that was natural and sincere. She was a modern and beloved queen. In August 1935, the royal family was on holiday in Switzerland. The king and queen had spent a few days hiking in the mountains and were staying at their villa near Lake Lucerne. Their children had already returned to Brussels for the start of the school year. On the morning of August 29th, Leopold and Astrid decided to go for one last mountain drive before heading home themselves. The king, an experienced driver, was at the wheel of their Packard convertible. Queen Astrid was in the passenger seat looking at a map and talking to her husband. A chauffeur was in the back seat. They were driving along a narrow road on the shore of the lake near the town of Kuusnacht am Rigi. The details of what happened next are tragically simple. The queen pointed to something on the map, or perhaps out the window. The king, for just a second, glanced away from the road to look. In that single moment of inattention, the car's right wheels went off the edge of the road. Leopold tried to swerve back, but he lost control. The car shot across the road, went down a small embankment, and crashed into a pear tree. The impact was on the passenger side. The force of the collision threw Queen Astrid from the car. She struck her head against the trunk of the tree. King Leopold was also thrown from the vehicle, but he was only lightly injured. The chauffeur was thrown clear and suffered more serious injuries. The king, dazed, rushed to his wife's side, but her head injury was catastrophic. She died in his arms on the shore of the lake, moments after the crash. She was only 29 years old. The news was devastating for Belgium. The country was united in its grief for its young, beautiful queen, taken so suddenly. King Leopold, who had seen his wife die before his eyes, was a broken man. He was never the same again. His reign would later be mired in controversy during World War II, but in 1935, he was a tragic figure, a husband mourning his wife. The site of the crash became a memorial. A chapel was built there, and the pear tree was cut down, but its trunk was encased in glass. For years afterward, Belgians would make pilgrimages to the site to mourn their lost queen. The death of Queen Astrid was a national trauma. It was a reminder that even for those who live fairy tale lives, tragedy can strike in the most ordinary of moments, on a quiet road on a summer morning. Number 3, how does an empress watch her entire world crumble? She was a German princess who became the last empress of Russia. She was a devoted wife and a loving mother, but she was also shy, deeply religious, and out of touch with the people she ruled. She sought guidance from a mystic peasant who many saw as a demon. Tsarina Alexandra Fyodorovna's life was a study in contrasts, immense privilege, and profound tragedy. Her death, alongside her husband and 5 children in a dusty basement in Siberia, was the brutal and shocking end of the 300-year-old Romanov dynasty. Alexandra was born Princess Alix of Hesse and by Rhine in 1872. She was a granddaughter of Queen Victoria of Great Britain. She fell in love with Nicholas, the heir to the Russian throne, and they married in 1894, shortly after his father's death. She became Tsarina of Russia, but she was never comfortable in her role. She disliked the lavish Russian court and was seen as cold and aloof by the public. Her primary focus was her family. Her life was dominated by a terrible secret. Her only son and heir, Alexei, born in 1904, after 4 daughters, had hemophilia. It was a genetic disease, passed down from Queen Victoria's line, that prevented his blood from clotting. Any small bumper cut could lead to a life-threatening bleed. Alexandra lived in constant terror for her son's life. Mainstream doctors could do little to help him. This desperation led her to Grigory Rasputin. He was a Siberian peasant and a self-proclaimed holy man. He seemed to have a mysterious ability to stop Alexei's bleeding, likely through a form of hypnotism that calmed the boy and lowered his blood pressure. Alexandra became completely dependent on him. She saw him as a man of God, sent to save her son. But to the Russian public and the aristocracy, Rasputin was a corrupt and debauched charlatan who had a sinister influence over the Empress. As Russia stumbled through World War I and Tsar Nicholas II was away at the front, Alexandra and Rasputin were effectively in charge of the government. Their mismanagement and the scandals surrounding Rasputin helped to destroy the last vestiges of public support for the monarchy. In March 1917, the situation exploded. Food shortages and war weariness led to riots in the capital, Petrograd. The revolution had begun. The army joined the protesters. On March 15, 1917, Tsar Nicholas II was forced to abdicate his throne. The Romanov dynasty was over. The family Nicholas, Alexandra, their 4 daughters Olga, Tatiana, Maria, and Anastasia, and their son Alexei were placed under house arrest. They were first held at a palace outside Petrograd, then moved to Tobolsk in Siberia, and finally to Ekaterinburg in the Ural Mountains. And they were now prisoners of the new Bolshevik government led by Vladimir Lenin. As the Russian Civil War raged, the White Army, which was loyal to the Tsar, began to advance on Ekaterinburg. The local Bolshevik leaders feared that the Romanovs might be rescued and become a rallying point for the anti-Bolshevik forces. A decision was made in Moscow. The entire family had to be eliminated. In the early hours of July 17, 1918, the family was woken up. They were told there was unrest in the town and they needed to be moved to the basement of the house, the Ipatiev house, for their own safety. They were led down into a small, bare room. Nicholas, Alexandra, their 5 children, their doctor, and 3 servants waited. A squad of armed men, led by Yakov Yurovsky, entered the room. Yurovsky read out an order. The Ural Soviet of Workers' Deputies had sentenced them to death. Nicholas was stunned. Before he could fully react, Yurovsky raised a pistol and shot him. That was the signal. The other men opened fire. The room filled with smoke and screams. Alexandra was killed almost instantly. The shooting was chaotic and brutal. When the smoke cleared, some of the children were still alive. The jewels that had been sewn into their clothing for safekeeping had acted as a form of body armor, deflecting some of the bullets. The killers moved in to finish the job with bayonets and bullets at close range. It was a horrific end. The bodies were taken away, burned, doused in acid, and thrown into an abandoned mine shaft. The Bolsheviks tried to keep the details secret, but the story eventually came out. For decades, mystery and rumors surrounded their fate, fueling stories of survivors like Anastasia. But in the end, the truth was just a grim story of a family caught in the crossfire of history, their imperial world ending violently in a dark, bloody cellar. Number 2. Did a dying empress take her rival with her? For nearly 50 years, she was the most powerful person in China. She began as a low-ranking concubine and rose to become the de facto ruler of the Qing dynasty. Empress Dowager Cixi was a master of political maneuvering, a survivor who clung to power with an iron will. Her own death in 1908 was not unexpected, as she was elderly and ill. But the death of the emperor, one day before her, was deeply suspicious. It seems almost certain that as she felt her own life ending, she made sure she would not leave her political prisoner and rival behind to undo her legacy. Cixi entered the Forbidden City in 1852 as a teenager, one of many concubines for the Jianfeng Emperor. She gained his favor by giving birth to his only surviving son in 1856. When the emperor died in 1861, her 5-year-old son became the Tongzi emperor. Cixi, along with the emperor's official wife, became co-regent. Through a series of brilliant political moves, she outmaneuvered her rivals and consolidated power. From that point on, she was the ruler of China in all but name. When her son died young, she installed her 3-year-old nephew on the throne as the Guangxu emperor in 1875. She continued to rule as regent. When he came of age, he was supposed to take over, but Cixi had no intention of giving up power. The Guangxu emperor was an intelligent and reform-minded young man. He believed that China had to modernize to survive the pressures of the West and Japan. In 1898, he launched the 100 Days Reform, a series of sweeping edicts to change China's government, military, and education system. This was a direct threat to Cixi and the conservative officials who supported her. Cixi saw the reforms as a challenge to her authority and the traditions of the dynasty. With the backing of the army, she staged a coup. She put the Guangxu emperor under house arrest on a small island within the Forbidden City. She reversed all his reforms and resumed her role as absolute ruler. For the next 10 years, the Guangxu emperor was her prisoner. He was a frail and melancholy figure, powerless, his hopes for China crushed. He was watched constantly. Cixi was in her 70s and her health was failing, but she held on. The question of what would happen when she died loomed over the court. Would the Guangxu emperor be freed? Would he restart his reforms and punish those who had supported Cixi? It was a future Cixi could not tolerate. In November 1908, both Cixi and the Guangxu emperor became seriously ill. On November 14th, the emperor died. He was only 37 years old. The very next day, Empress Dowager Cixi also died. The timing was extraordinarily convenient. On her deathbed, Cixi had named a new heir, her 2-year-old grandnephew Pui, ensuring another long regency where her family would remain in control. For a century, the official story was that the emperor had died of natural causes, likely tuberculosis. But rumors of foul play persisted. Many believed that Cixi, knowing she was about to die, had the emperor poisoned. She could not bear the thought of him outliving her and taking revenge on her clan and her legacy. In 2008, 100 years after their deaths, modern science provided a stunning answer. A team of Chinese researchers and forensic experts conducted a detailed multi-year study on the Guangxu emperor's remains. They tested strands of his hair, samples of his bones, and fragments of his clothing. They found massive levels of arsenic. The amount of arsenic in his system was more than 2,000 times higher than that found in a normal person. The conclusion was undeniable. The Guangxu emperor had died of acute arsenic poisoning. The evidence points directly at Cixi. No one else had the motive and the opportunity. As she lay dying, she must have given the order. It was her final, ruthless act of power. She ensured that her prisoner would not outlive her by even a single day. Her long and powerful reign ended not just with her own death, but with a final, cold-blooded murder to protect her legacy. Number 1. What happens when a queen's defiance leads to her final stand? She was the queen of a Celtic tribe in Roman-occupied Britain. When the Romans betrayed her, flogged her, and attacked her daughters, she did not surrender. She raised an army. She became a warrior queen, a symbol of resistance who led a massive rebellion that burned Roman cities to the ground and almost drove the empire out of Britain. The death of Boudica is shrouded in mystery, but her story is a powerful account of a queen who chose to fight for her people's freedom, even when it led to her own destruction. Here, Boudica was the wife of Prasutagus, the king of the Iceni, a tribe that lived in what is now Norfolk in eastern England. The Iceni were initially allies of Rome after the Roman conquest of Britain in 43 AD. They were allowed to keep their kingdom as a client state. When Prasutagus died in 60 or 61 AD, he tried to protect his family and his people. In his will, he left his kingdom jointly to the Roman emperor and his own 2 daughters. He hoped this would satisfy Rome and preserve some independence for his tribe. He was wrong. The local Roman officials ignored the will. They saw the death of the king as an opportunity to seize the Iceni's lands and wealth. They declared the kingdom to be part of the Roman province. When Boudica protested, she was publicly flogged. Her daughters were assaulted. This was a profound humiliation, a brutal act of dominance designed to crush the spirit of the Iceni royal family. It had the opposite effect. The outrage over the treatment of their queen and princesses ignited a firestorm of rebellion. The Iceni, along with neighboring tribes who were also suffering under Roman rule, united behind Boudica. She was a striking figure, described by the Roman historian Cassius Dio as tall, with long red hair, a harsh voice, and a piercing glare. She became the leader of a massive army of rebels. Their vengeance was swift and terrible. They first marched on Camulodunum, modern Colchester, the Roman capital of Britain. It was a town full of retired Roman soldiers and a symbol of Roman oppression. Boudica's army overwhelmed the town's defenses and destroyed it, slaughtering its inhabitants. From there, they moved on Londinium, modern London, which was a thriving commercial center. The Roman governor Suetonius Paulinus was marching his army from Wales to confront the rebellion, but he realized he could not defend London. He abandoned the city. Boudica's forces swept in and burned Londinium to the ground. Archaeologists today can still find a thick red layer of burned debris under the city, a physical remnant of Boudica's destruction. The rebels then did the same to Verulamium, modern St. Albans. Roman historians claim that between 70,000 and 80,000 Romans and pro-Roman Britons were killed in the three cities. For a moment, it seemed like the rebellion might succeed. Boudica's army vastly outnumbered the Romans. But Suetonius was a skilled general. He finally chose a place to make his stand, somewhere in the English Midlands. The location is unknown, but he picked his ground carefully, a narrow gorge with a forest behind him, protecting his flanks and rear. This forced the Britons to attack him head-on, preventing them from using their superior numbers to surround him. The battle was a slaughter. The superior discipline, training, and weaponry of the Roman legions proved decisive against the tribal warriors. The Romans formed a solid wall of shields and threw their javelins into the charging Britons. Then they advanced in a tight wedge formation, cutting through the rebel army. The Britons, confident of victory, had brought their families in wagons to watch the battle from the rear. This blocked their escape route. The Roman army showed no mercy, killing not just the warriors, but the women and children as well. While Boudica's army was annihilated, what happened to the queen herself is not certain. The two main Roman historians who wrote about her give different accounts. Tacitus, the more reliable source, says that she poisoned herself rather than be captured. Cassius Dio says she fell ill and died after the battle and was given a lavish burial. Either way, she did not survive the defeat of her rebellion. She chose death over submission to the empire that had wronged her. Her final act was one of defiance, cementing her legacy as a warrior queen and one of Britain's earliest national heroes.